Here, come take the center chair. I'll move over here.
Slides thing is not working. It's the most important.
No, we got to, well,
I don't
part
have
of
a
it.
Google Authenticator code.
Yes, we're working fine.
Yeah.
We are hold on. That's why there are three of us, actually, is for redundancy.
Well,
If we happen to lose a working group chair in the middle of the meeting, we'll just continue as though two is sufficient.
Thanks, guys.
We don't have diagonal parity though, so the loss of two would be a catastrophic event. Okay. It's 1 minute over, so I guess we'll start. IETF 102 Netmod Working Group. If you are here for M-Bone D, you're at the wrong end of the building. So I'm Joel Yeagley. Kent Watson and Lou Berger are the other chairs. Our illustrious AD is actually sitting in the front row, looking diligent. If you see him run to the mic, it's probably because we have committed a grievous error. We have the note well. You should have read it several times by now, but it is included in all of the presentation startup materials in every session. So you should be really familiar and having completely internalized it by now. Blue sheets are going to be distributed. Please sign them so that we know that you are in the working group and that we can inform the secretariat of how many people we can expect in the meeting room. Apparently fewer directly after lunch. So all of these sessions are being streamed and recorded. So please, when you want to ask questions or communicate with the presenters, do so using the microphones, and please state your name for the record of the minutes before speaking, or when speaking. Blue sheets are being handed out. Do we have note takers? You're gonna, Kent is taking notes. Do we have a jabber scribe? Is there anybody who wants to hang out in the Meet Echo and scribe? You're gonna do that. Excellent. We are, yes, we're also using Etherpad, so we'll be taking notes there. I won't be doing any of those things since I guess we'll be presenting from my laptop. All right, so we have two sessions this week. This is session one, obviously. And session two is actually on Friday morning. We intend to use both of these sessions fully. So if you were planning on skipping Friday because you thought it would be light, we do have a full agenda there. So especially if your draft happens to be presented there, it's probably a good plan to show up for the Friday session. Okay, session one. We have 10 minutes for the agenda, so I don't need to pad this out too much. Our presentations are going to be the interface extensions discussion led by Rob Walton, Yang module tags, Yang data extensions, and Yang module versioning. That is the design team exercise, and that actually is expected to take up the balance of the session. Session two, we're going to look at a bunch of the recent submissions or documents that we have taken updates for regularly. I believe that we have at least 7 of those currently scheduled. And since the last meeting, we have 2 new RFCs, RFC 8348 and 8349. So that is the entity module and the 8022 BIS work. We've submitted a bunch of drafts towards the tail end of Benoit's tenure and to get and to keep Ignaz busy. So that was 6087 BIS. That's now in the RFC editor queue. syslog model is actually misrefed because it has a dependency. ACL model is in IESG review right now, and schema mount, which we actually managed to get closure on in London, is now also in RFC in IESG review. So the things that depend on schema mount that are sitting in misref will likely shortly exit that position. So a whole bunch of we've broken a log jam, and a whole bunch of documents are coming free. We have no post last call documents right now. Working group documents that are on the agenda this time include the interface extensions, the sub-interface VLAN model, module tags, and the Yang data extensions. Somebody else want to talk about the liaisons, since I'm actually not that familiar with that activity?
Well, I don't have too much more to add than what's on the slide. The one thing I'll point out is that I believe the broadband forum liaison just got refreshed. It's basically the same liaison, but it was just sent to the list. So clearly they're looking for some reaction. So we really encourage you all to look at the liaisons. If you have any comments on them or have any thoughts, suggestions on responses, if you think they're necessary, please send those comments to the list. If you really don't want to send it to the list, you can send it to the chairs.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, so that's it. So I think we can actually step into our agenda as soon as I can find my pointer. Okay, so I think Rob Wilton is the first presenter with the interface extensions.
It's not old. Oh, that's small.
Let's see here.
It has to be big other than module tags. I'm gonna struggle. Okay, fine.
Interface extensions, there it is. Oh, did it actually? That's the one that is a PowerPoint. Is it?
I won't take 15 minutes.
On Chrome.
We apologize. We lost the Chromebook right before the start of the session, so it's just taking us a few minutes extra.
Ready to go? Hi, so I'm Rob Wilton, and I'm just presenting an update on these two drafts. So there's not that much to say, so I'll go through them relatively quickly. The two drafts, the interface extensions draft is adding some sort of common functionality to interfaces that wasn't in the original interfaces model. This work has been going for quite a while, and it was sort of slightly languishing because the NMDA work took priority, getting that out finished. More recently, I've now updated the draft with examples, which was one of the sort of key outstanding things to do. And I think this draft is pretty much, well, very closely ready for a working group last call. There's two issues that still remain to be resolved. There's some comments from Andy Beeman in the Yang Docs review. I just need to check that they've been addressed. I think most of them have been. I want to check they've all been done. And then there was a bandwidth leaf that was in the original model, and I'll cover that in a bit more detail. So the other issue that I want to resolve is this bandwidth leaf. It was in my original model added in. I noticed that several vendors had this, and I'd removed it from the most recent version. When I spoke to AC, I had some feedback. There was some discussion as to whether this leaf could be targeted towards a sort of configurable tunnel reservable bandwidth. So I think I need to get closure on that issue from AC. I might chat to you as well, Lou. might be helpful, to see if it's useful to include this leaf, and if it is, whether it goes into this model or whether it goes somewhere else if there's a better place for it. But I don't want that to really hold this draft up. I want to effectively either choose one way or another, either it goes in and we're done, or it doesn't, and we move on without it. So that's effectively the only minor things to resolve. So I think that this one should be able to go to working group last call fairly soon. Are there any comments or questions on this one at all? It's not on.
See if there's a switch.
That one is wired.
Oh.
So I think it's on this way. Yeah.
I have one comment that's only related to these drafts. In general, I think these drafts are excellent and very good value for people who are implementing these things. But I had some troubles in using these drafts together with the IEEE drafts. In particular, I had a problem with implementing simple configuration for a transparent bridge that takes just 4 lines in OpenWRT. But of course, there is now a Yang module .1Q from something from IEEE, which is a terrible overkill, and it's not structured well enough to be able to just take some part that's relevant for my work. So we had some discussion about that. So I would like to ask whether there is some option. The IEEE liaisoning was mentioned. I don't know if we can do reviews of their modules, because I believe some kind of better structuring of their modules would be immensely useful, but I don't know if we can really do this.
Yeah, so I think the answer is the boat's probably sailed already on that one. So the IEEE model has been around for quite a long time, and it's been developed independently with some awareness of this, but they want to have their own, I think they have their own configuration model already for those devices. I think they're trying to provide a complete solution that maps quite close to the 82.1Q draft. So they are more constrained, I think, in terms of how they implement it. And although I would have liked to see them reusing like the sub-interface constructs and things, that doesn't actually necessarily work with their model or with the devices that implement the .1Q model. So in not this draft, the next one I talk about, I've given examples of how to use sub-interfaces with the L2PN model, and that allows you to do transparent bridging as well. Maybe not quite the same sort of flexibility in terms of VLAN awareness, but that might be another option. I see somebody's posted a draft today about transparent forwarding or something. Again, I don't think it's tied into this model, but potentially should be. There will be possibly issues with it, with IEEE .1Q working group in terms of IETF standardizing that. They'll say that that's sort of stepping on their toes, I suspect. So I think it's a bit tricky in terms of ownership of concepts and the split of work.
Yeah, it is, but my concern is that somebody who just wants to implement something and takes this might think that this Yang is just a pile of crap. And so my solution for that case was to write a simple module myself instead, but that's not, of course, a good solution. So
yeah, so I don't have an answer to that. I suspect you can't standardize that anywhere. That's the problem. I don't think that IEEE would take it. I don't think IETF would take it because of the conflict with IEEE. Oh, hello. Scott.
Hi, Scott Mansfield Erickson, also a frequent attendee of IEEE as well as IETF and other things. So this issue of Yang coordination is something that the IETF, or that the IEEE has been trying to take very seriously for the last year or so. And the IEEE and the ITUT have been coordinating on work to ensure that the ITU's performance monitoring aspects, that they're creating a Yang model on that for Ethernet, and it needs to work with the .1Q and the CFM modules that the IEEE is creating.
Yep.
Okay, that's my preface. To back up your point about .1Q, the .1Q document is past whatever the magic process is in the IEEE to become an IEEE standard. And so that draft and all the associated modules associated with it are what you got right now, and that's going to be the standard. There is upwards of 8 or 9 other modules being done in the IEEE that also have to work and augment the work that happens in .1Q. So it's a pain that people in the IEEE are feeling as well. So having said all of that, I wanted to point out that there are opportunities for collaboration if people want to as individuals. There is a meeting of a Yang group in the IEEE the last Wednesday of every month. There is the third Monday of every month, there's an ITU coordination meeting for Yang. So if there are IETF people that are interested, if there's work that we can do, the IEEE does use the Yang catalog and it stores its drafts there. And if you put comments on the drafts, they will be considered when you look at the Yang that's in the Yang catalog. So there are ways to collaborate and ways to get comment back in, even if you're not an IEEE member. So I'll leave it there. If you want to talk about that, there's lots of coordination opportunities. Thanks.
Scott, what do you think about Lotta's specific suggestion of composing a liaison on the topic? Would that be helpful?
I think liaisons are helpful because it's an official statement from the working group to another group, but it's helpful. But what I think is more helpful is if individuals do this collaboration that we have a couple times a month and really become part of the process, because as we've seen, as the industry changes and standardization changes, throwing liaisons at one another is not the way to get progress to happen. We need to have people working in both organizations following their relative organizational paths and processes to get change to happen. So unfortunately, I think you're right. We missed the boat on helping to restructure .1Q, but there's plenty of opportunity to work with Broadband Forum, MEF, ITU, IEEE in Yang, and making sure all the Yang is happy when you put it in a pot and run Yang on it. So,
I mean, I think actually there's a fundamental issue here that there's almost 2 different configuration models that evolve in the industry. There's one that is IEEE.1Q based, and there's one that's IETF based, I think. And those 2 things are developing in parallel. So there's going to be an issue with features like CFM that belongs to IEEE camp and are going to naturally fit into that model, but they're not going to work with sub-interfaces. So I don't know how you resolve that.
And this is very important to shore up that point as well. It is very important to understand that the CFM module that's being written in the IEEE at this point is being written so that it can work without being tied to a .1Q bridge.
Oh, okay.
It's the same for the work that the ITU is doing on performance monitoring. It doesn't have to work with a .1Q bridge. It could be something from the Broadband Forum. It could be something from some other group that wants. So it's important to modularize these things. And unfortunately, .1Q became a little too monolithic from the way that it was put together. But that's not to say that we can't change it moving forward. So that's why talking now would be good.
This is as much for the chairs as the room. Do you think this issue rises to the level where it's worth trying to coordinate a discussion at the next meeting, given that the IETF and IEEE are meeting back to back?
Well, they're already, my opinion, sorry, Scott Mansfield again. My opinion is that since there already is basically a standing group that tries to coordinate IETF and IEEE together anyway, getting a smaller group than that's focused on Yang, getting something that's even focused not just specifically on Yang, but how data modeling is done in general. Because what happens when Yang becomes the has-been, and there's the next Yang, right? So we need to have the opinion and the understanding of the community that we have objects that need to be managed, and who creates the protocols to manage those objects are important as well. So having that conversation would be good.
I got lost there by people
Sorry.
walking by.
Oh,
Are you saying that, yes, we should try something?
I'm
or
saying,
you're
yes,
saying
we
that-
should. I think since what I said was, yes, we should. Okay, focus on the goal now. The goal. Focus on the goal.
Should we do that in the context of this other meeting that you've talked about?
Well,
or
that's-
should we try to do
that
something
might- well-
separately?
Okay, let me start again, and I'll try to get to the end without distraction, right? The, we have a group. My suggestion is getting a subset of that group to work on, that are interested in Yang, to work on the Yang issue. Yes.
Okay, we'd love to work with you offline to try to bring that about. Thank you.
On that issue. Because there is already a group, there's an IEEE.
We'll talk offline
Yeah.
and figure out if it's already happening, then great. We don't have to do anything. We just
Well,
have to make
sort
everyone
of,
aware of it.
yeah, okay.
Yeah. I'd like to also reiterate that we are using Etherpad, and it'd be really helpful to get a few people in there taking notes. You don't have to take every sentence, but just adding a sentence or two really helps. You can go to the tools page and find it, or off the agenda. Please join and take notes.
Okay, so I think that closes out that draft, and then do I seem to not have any clicker anymore? I've got no action.
It's not
Next
clicking.
slide, please. So the other draft I want to quickly update on is the sub-interface model. So I've added examples in here for L2 and L3 sub-interfaces, which actually has been very illustrative of some issues. I added an example using the L3PN Yang model, and actually when you put that into instance data, I noticed some cases where I think it's missing a container at one level which should be there, and hence it doesn't look as neat as you'd expect it to. So I'll feed that back into the L3PN Yang model authors, and that might need an update to the Yang model if they decide to change it, but it's not, it's informative rather than normative. And then I still need to check with the .1Q working group that they're happy with the changes I've made previously. So that needs to be resolved, that they're still happy with the structure. I hope they will be. Otherwise, again, this one I think is ready for working group last call. I don't know if John's here today. I don't see him. So, any questions on this one?
A little while ago, we did say that we would do a liaison at some point on these documents, just to do an official notification that they were ready.
Mhm.
It looked like we're close, or are we there? What do you think?
I think we're probably there that we could do that to IEEE and check that they're happy.
Care to draft a
Yep.
something
Nice.
for us?
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Chris? I lost my network.
Well, at the very beginning, I saw it pop up 3 times. All right. Right, so this is just an update to module tags. A very small update was posted recently, basically based on Andy's comments to the list. And so that's what this slide will address. So, right, there was a recommendation that we clean up the text on the old version said that all module definitions that include tags, the tags would be standardized. I'm not sure if he meant the subtlety that I took from that, but I clarified and said all standardized module definitions are standardizing tags, right? I mean, that's kind of like the mechanism by which you standardize a tag is through like an RFC publication. So I didn't, another suggestion was, well, there was a recommendation to vendors to put an org name or something that would probably keep collisions from happening, like example.com. So I took that in. I didn't adopt the extension Andy had said he wanted, he thought it should be machine readable, but it adds a lot of complexity that I don't think is really required. Right now, we specify what tags should go when a designer wants tags added to a module. They put it in the description text. That's really a directive towards the implementer, right? It's not something that parses. It's not something that goes and gets parsed and then auto generates the code to implement a model, right? I mean, there's actually some human being who actually writes the code. So adding the complexity of having, PyYang and all these various things have to support this extension, I don't think it's that worthwhile. But that was it from the comments, I think. Oh, there was one other, so there's two other issues. One is a small one, which I guess we could go either way on. Right now, it's a list at the root. And I think Andy said we don't want to do that. It should be a container at the root with a list inside of it. I could go either way on that. I don't really care. The other one that Rob and I were talking about is the solution we have here. We're doing something in this draft. We're doing something that might come up later in other people might need, and that we're doing the concept of like a whiteout, right? So we're deleting something through configuration. Right, so it would be the case here is if a vendor adds a tag, says I support this feature, and then as an operator I say no, in fact you don't. Your implementation is buggy, so I want to remove that tag. Right. So the way we do that is we have a mask list, but this is kind of a general concept, right, where you might have dynamic configuration that's added that as the final arbiter you want to remove. And how do we do that? We might want to think about that. I don't think this should be the driver for that. I think we have a fine solution here, but it might be something to think about. And if we do come up with some better solution before this gets published, then we could incorporate it. But again, I don't think we should block on that. Right. So I think we're probably ready for working group last call or to ask for it.
I'm a co-author, so me too.
Well, I mean, that's a question that we can ask, the sense of the room. Who here has read the document either in its present form or in a previous draft? That is a healthy set of the room. Do people think this is ready for working group last call? We can take a hum on that.
Since I can't really hear and discriminate hums, I'd like to see hands. We're not counting.
Okay, we can do hands too. So who in the room believes that this document is ready for last call? Yeah, that's a significant fraction of the people who've read it. Is there anybody who thinks it's unready? Okay, we'll take that to the list.
Great, thanks. Well, are there any comments?
Okay, Ken Watson, Juniper Networks, presenting Yang data extensions. This was presented last time by Andy. We actually haven't made much progress on the draft. But to recap, RFC 8040 defines Yang data in the IETF RESTconf module. It was never intended at that time to be used outside of that draft. It's really just defining protocol operations and errors for RESTconf. Hence, it's neither an ideal definition or having an ideal location, like it being inside the RESTconf draft. It's not, what do you want to say, expected if from other module designers. The current draft defines two extensions. There's Yang data and then augment Yang data. Next slide talks about both. Yang data is intended to be a better definition. It's slightly more tightly defined than the version that's in 8040. It's also a better normative reference and import target. So you'll be importing IETF Yang data instead of IETF RESTConf, which is nicer for drafts like zero touch and instance data and subscribe notifications, all that are currently wanting to use Yang data. Two of them are currently pointing at this draft, and I think subscribe notifications is still pointing at RFC 8040. Notice I say here it's nicer for zero touch. It used to be that it was needed for zero touch. If some of you may recall, there was a discussion regarding a top level choice over 2 containers and whether or not that was actually compatible with the definition that was in RFC 8040. After some discussions with my co-authors, who are also my co-authors of RFC 8040, we decided that if necessary, we could clarify the definition that's in RFC 8040 to make it usable by zero touch. So it's no longer, we don't need this draft any longer, but it'd be nice for the reason just mentioned. Also, there's Yang data, augment Yang data, which is actually needed for the notification messages draft, which is in the NetConf working group. And also it's needed for an effort that I'm aware of Joe Clark is working on that augments instance data. And so he also wanted, or has posted to the list that he's wanting to have this augment Yang data extension available. So one of the extension statements is nice to have, the other one's must have. Or, well, we can debate what it means. You must have it. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so last time we actually thought we were done, but then some working group members raised viability concerns and concluded that a proper definition should be part of a new version of Yang. I think the history of the original Yang data that was even in RESTConf, I recall you had a lot of concerns about that definition, and you've re-raised some of those concerns with this effort. Jürgen's also posted some serious concerns about whether or not we should be doing this or waiting for a next version of Yang. Andy has, obviously he's a co-author on this draft, but there's an aspect of this draft that he's uncomfortable with, which I do have a last slide to touch on if necessary. And then I think Martin and I are supporting this draft going forward as is. Go ahead.
I think the fundamental problem is really that an extension is defined in RFC 7950 as something that attaches non-Yang semantics to statements, whereas here we are changing Yang. So inside this Yang data, the semantics of Yang statements is different. So I think this violates this principle, and there are, I guess, 2 problems to this. I understand it's really something that's needed, and it's very convenient. You can define some schema of independent of encoding and so on. But on the other hand, if we do this, of course, if you or Martin or young experts use this, I'm sure they will know what they are doing, so it will be okay. But this way, we propose it as a standard, as a normal way of using Yang, which it isn't. And by the way, it also shows vendors or other people a way how to redefine Yang. So I will just put some extension at the top, and then I can use a different syntax for regular expressions, let's say, and things like this. So I believe this is really a slippery slope. So if we want to use it internally, then let's use this RESTConf thing and just live with the limitations it has, because I don't think this is a good.
So just if I can be clear, your concerns are equally valid against RFC 8040, right? I mean, you're also, those were your concerns before, right?
Yeah, but in RESTConf in RFC 8040, it's just some right. Marginal way, which is not, and by itself, it's not the official standard. The official standard is RESTConf. So this way, we are officializing these things that are really not wise to do.
Okay.
A lot of clarification. Why do you say it's not official?
Yeah, because-
it's in a standard Yang model. It could be included. It's an extension. It would be. It's just as usable there as it is as a standalone.
I can give you an example. If you, before this work start, if you asked this working group who knows about something that's called Yang data extension, I would say maybe 5% of people would admit they knew it. So it's really something that it can be used, it can be even useful, but I wouldn't recommend to give it to people as a standard tool for the data modeling, because it just redefines quite important things in Yang, that like the XPath context and so on. And so
it's really just the promotion of awareness.
It really undermines the value of Yang as a standard. And I think it was in IETF 87 that I proposed to change the definition of Yang to remove the netcom specific parts and so on, and to enable such uses as we now have. But this didn't happen, and I don't know if, I think it's not the right way to do it this way by extensions.
Right. Just a follow-up. So your concern is the pollution of what it means to define an extension. It's not so much this extension, it's just what is the nature of extensions in general.
Yes.
And that being the case, there wouldn't, do you think there's a possibility that there could be an applicability statement or something like this inside this draft that would sort of, I mean, I don't know if it's the right, I mean, you think an applicability statement would really be about Yang data, not so much the use of the extension. But
yeah, but if it is a proposed standard, I would expect it to be offered to people to use. I don't know.
Okay, so perfect. So that is in fact the concern.
I'm still a little lost on Lada's point. Is it that you don't like Yang, the data extension, or you don't like extensions?
I don't like any extensions that change Yang semantics, so that change the outcome of what you think that the schema is and what the semantic constraints are and so on. So we already had several discussions like this. One of them was this syntax for patterns. I don't know, there were other points like this. And so far, my understanding was that really you can use it as in NACM, for example. There's an extension that attaches some authorization related semantics to Yang statements, which is okay. Authorization has nothing to do with Yang, so that's fine. But as soon as we start changing what's written in RFC 7950, then it's really a problem in my view.
Since we have this, since the base extension that we're talking about, that I think you're really talking against, is already in an RFC, maybe what you really want to do is put out a draft that says this is the right way to use extensions, and in there capture what you're talking about, and we can as a group agree with you or disagree with you, and then follow that course. I sort of feel like the ship has sailed on this one because it's already done, and it's just whether or not to be publishing.
Yeah, but it's not already done, because now you have this Yang data augment thing that was not in RESTCon, which is another. So people might want to add other things to this, and it will just become a new Yang that defined using extensions, and it's really impossible. In my way, it just undermines the value of Yang as a standard. And people outside this working group can be really confused by this, and they can misuse it in all possible ways. So I don't like it really.
Okay.
So question, Rob Wilson, Cisco, a question for Lada actually is if this was done in Yang 1.2 or Yang 2.0, would you be any happier with that, or would you still think the basic premise of what's being done here is not good?
Yes, I would be happy, and this is actually what I proposed in Berlin a couple of years ago. And so it means what we could do is to really remove the netcom specific parts, to to make basically Yang just limited to defining the schema and things like what we have in RFC 7950, like different data stores and XML encoding, which is the only encoding actually officially defined at the time for Yang. So I think this could be done really, I mean, a new specification for Yang could be really slim, not much text. So it would mean, in my view, remove some text and then write other specifications for, like using Yang for Netcon, for things like this.
Right. And just to clarify what Rob was saying, I think that if a new version of Yang were to come out, it might define this statement, Yang data is a top-level statement, but without the use of the extension statement. It would just be itself a top-level statement. So in that sense, it wouldn't be polluting what it means to have an extension statement.
Maybe that was a misunderstanding. I don't know, Rob, did you mean to have something like Yang data in Yang 1.2? Yeah. No, my idea was just to use Yang just for anything, not only for the data store content without any wrappers, so it will be useful for any purpose, like I don't know what instance data for.
So Robertson, so basically saying to make Yang more generic, more generically used. Yeah, I don't know.
I think it would be to use Yang to define the data model without any notion of where that data model is being used, if it's configuration or state or a file, or it's just the model. Okay, so great conversation, which leads us right into how should we proceed as a working group. We have three options in front of us, I think. The first option is to stick with the current scope of defining both the Yang data and the augment Yang data. The second option is to only define augment Yang data. Remember, there was the nice to have and must have, so this would actually still provide for those other drafts that wanted to use or need to use augment Yang data. Or we could unadopt this draft, which would mean that those other drafts that are currently referring to this draft would have to then point to RFC 8040. And for those drafts that want to use augment Yang data, where you just kick the can down the road and they need to revisit this idea later. So we actually kind of need to get a sense from the room at this time. Maybe the chairs can help with this.
Rob, did you want to say something before we got started?
Well, I was going to express a preference. So
I can't hear you.
who's going to express a preference?
I was going to express a preference. We're going to ask the room, then I get a chance to do that anyway. So.
Okay, so to be clear on option 2, you're not getting rid of Yang data. You would just use the definition in RFC, what is it, 8040?
8040, correct. Yeah, what I
so-
mean is it would not be defined in this draft. Only the augment Yang data would be
Right, so the difference between 1 and 2 is whether it becomes sort of a standalone first order definition as opposed to something buried in another document.
Yes.
Okay. Shall we do a poll?
Yeah.
Preferences, 1, 2, or 3. So let's start with 1. I'd say that I would call that a few.
And Martin also supports 1.
Okay, I see that as a few. Do you want to make a comment before I go to 2?
I would, Joe Clark, Cisco, I would prefer 1, but I could also live with 2. I hear what you're saying, and I like your idea of the Yang next. I want an augment Yang data, or I want some way to define a thing, something to represent a thing that isn't necessarily implemented on in a data store, and then I want to be able to augment that. I don't think any of the other drafts, what I'm working on is currently internal. I don't think any of the other drafts need that requirement, but for me, I don't mind referencing 8040 and this, so I'm kind of like 1 or 2. Either way would satisfy me.
Okay, so 2. If you're interested, if you want to pursue 2, hands? That's no one.
Except for Joe.
No, Joe said he prefers one, but could accept two.
I mean, but if we're going with ranked
He
preference.
didn't raise his hand.
And are you checking Jabber as well?
Right. I mean, I think there's this, yeah.
All right, 3. I would say it is approximately the same as 1, although it's a little less. Jürgen is online, and Jürgen, in fact, in Jabber says number 3. So we're actually pretty split on this. We usually don't unadopt. That said, we do a working group last call, and one of the comments in the last call is no way, and we hit reset. So it's not like just because we adopt it, it's set in stone.
Robert and Cisco. So one comment is, depending on, I don't think we're going to discuss Yang next at all, not today, but if we discuss it on Friday, maybe the outcome of that discussion might drive into whether we do this or not, or delay this, or...
Well, there's another way to put that though, also, which is to ask, like, who cannot live with number 1? Is there anybody who, absolutely cannot live with number 1? Okay, so I mean, that's a data point too.
That was, just to be clear for the record, that was no one.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think we definitely have more interest in working on this than not, but we don't actually have a we don't have an exit strategy at the moment.
I think that leaves us with, let's continue working on this document and see how it progresses. Given the last question, by the way, I wasn't going to say that until you asked the last question. That was a good question to ask. Yeah.
Actually, I can live with this draft, and perhaps I may even be using it in the future. Because it's really useful, but I think that...
Right, I mean, that's actually a fairly important distinction. Like, I use lots of stuff that I don't like very much, right? That is, in fact, the nature of some IETF work, right? But it's really important if you can divine that, like, people have genuinely good reasons why they really don't want to do something. Like, those are important, super important to capture, like, if they exist.
So as far as improving the document to getting to last call, I do have next slide that covers one issue. But in addition, and that's the only one issue I'm aware of, but in addition to that, I do recall a little while back, Martin saying something about the wanting to clean up a little bit more of the definitions in this document if we were to move forward with it. So even though I'm only going to cover one issue, there's actually 2.
But before you go there, at some point when we start talking about how we add features to the language, it's going to be worthwhile to consider that there's multiple ways to do it, whether we do something like a 1.2 or we use this extensions. And I actually accept what I think a lot of this implication is that we're actually not using, we're abusing the language a little bit. But if that allows us to be a little more nimble, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
And actually, to the point about Yang next, but the potential discussion we may have on Friday, or maybe even some today, if we were to go that route, I fear we're probably at least adding a year, if not more, time until this would become RFC status, which then would put a lot of drafts like Zero Touch and the other ones I mentioned into misref state for that amount of time. So. I'm sorry, just one more comment. If that were the case, if we made that decision, then as the author of the Zero Touch draft, I would immediately point it back to 80/40, just so I can get it out to the RFC instead.
So, Rob Wilson, so based on Lada's comment, I would like to retract my option 3 and only support option 1, actually. I think if he's saying that people want to use this, it makes sense. But and also to go to Lou's comment that maybe we should consider whether we refine how extension statements are allowed to be used. If the issue is one about how extension statements are defined today and limiting their scope, and we're finding that that this is hampering us and making our life harder, should we consider changing that?
Well, I think we have an existence proof in 8040 that it's not hampering us.
But maybe it should have been hampering us, but
Maybe
we're bypassing the rules already, and maybe it'd be better to document that actually allowed to do that.
I think you're right. It's a good discussion.
Okay, great. So now that I think, are iterating towards option number one, there is a question with regards to the Yang data definition, and specifically if Yang data can have the same name as a top-level node. So is this legal or not? You have module foo with container bar, but also Yang data containing container bar. And so the options here are yes, it's legal because only one bar can exist in any given context. If you're talking to a server and you say get data, then you're going to get the bar that's the first bar. But if you're looking at an offline instance document that you're being told through context that's provided to you outside the document itself, then it's understood that you're only receiving the second bar, the Yang data bar. That'd be the no. No, because the instance document alone, given the extra context, may be ambiguous, right? So some people feel maybe, and just to be clear, Andy is definitely in the no category on this one. So probably it's on Jabber. He's about to say that, but yeah, he's definitely thinking that need to have, given an instance document, he feels like. Notice I say the instance document alone with no context. So he's thinking there's no extra context. So in that case, you don't actually know, is it representing an instance of configuration or is it representing the Yang data? So, but the flip is that the devil's argument is that, well, you would have some context to make that not be an ambiguous case. So go ahead.
Balázs Lengyel Eriksson. Sorry, I didn't read the very last version. As I understand, it is possible to define multiple Yang data extensions side by side in a module.
Yes.
So probably that's also a possible conflict. If you have multiple, in each of these you have the same root element defined.
So for those, we would definitely have to clarify that there can be no name conflicts amongst all the Yang datas.
Let's go then all the way and no.
So you're, okay. Well, anyway, we do need to get a sense from the room on this one as well, I think. Or any more comments, actually, first? All right, so.
I think you can run this as a technical, not a procedural thing.
Okay.
So if you want.
Oh, all right, yeah, sure. So actually, could I get a raise of hands for those who think that this should be allowed? It's legal. I and Martin, I know Martin also feels that this should be allowed. So a few. And then for those who think it should not be allowed, please raise your hand. And also a few, but more. Double probably, I think. So, and I know, oh, sorry, there's a comment coming to the microphone.
I understand why it is important to say no here, because of course it can break tools who just want to have one Yang data node in this top level context. But in fact, if Yang data is used for defining an error message, there is really no reason why the error message couldn't have bar as a top element or whatever. So it's really some CLR that. And I'm afraid that we will need to come up with more such CLRs in order to make the thing work. And so it's really just some complication.
And I think actually Andy made that exact same point about tools and how we might have to go back and revisit some tools to ensure that they don't break. So I think more people were favoring no. And I know that Martin and I had previously in an authors meeting said that we would, capitulate and, if it's okay. We're okay. We can live with no is what I'm trying to say. So assuming that we're moving towards no, is there anyone in the room that cannot live with no? Like they actually feel like we must, or we really should support this. And one comment?
Hi, Shivon from Water. So I'd like to ask a clarification question. So this is for Yang data. For normal schema data, if we have a module, say Y, and we have a same bar with a container, that would be okay, right?
Can you repeat that again? What's your example?
So this is in the context of Yang data, but I'm asking in normal non-Yang data, just the schema.
Right.
Yang schema. So if I have one module full and another module bar with the same container,
Oh, those would be in different namespaces.
so that'd be fine.
Yeah, there's no
So
conflict
this
there.
is not affecting the
The issue is only when when the two things are being defined in the same module or the same namespace.
Because they resolve to the same path. In this
It's
case,
still
they
same module. You import it from another module. You got another namespace.
Oh, you're talking about a case where you're importing a
Yeah.
module, like importing a submodule, so
Yeah,
sharing the,
yeah.
well, okay. The resolution of the import, of the fact that you're importing some submodules doesn't actually change the nature of the model itself. So if we go with no, then it's going to be illegal in that case as well.
So that's legal, right? So just make sure it's
No,
still
it's not legal. If we're choosing no, and we're saying that this should not be legal, and if you're saying that this YD Yang data was actually brought into this module through an import of a submodule, like an include, I shouldn't say import, an include, then that would also not be legal. Because when you're using includes, it's just a way of factoring your Yang. It doesn't actually change the nature of namespaces.
So even include won't be legal either for Yang data, but for normal schema node. So let's put this way: we have a normal module full, and we have import from another module bar and put the container there. So they have a namespace bar the column container bar. So that.
But you're using the word import, and
Yeah.
through import, you're actually defining a new namespace.
Right.
So there's no conflict. Those are two separate modules.
Yes, just make sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, so I think the resolution here is no, we're not going to allow this to be a legal thing to do. All right, and with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.
So with that, we're going to move into, from the working group documents, solution documents, into the design team that we talked about at the last meeting that's looking at versioning or revisions or however you want to call it.
Right, so I'm going to give an update on what the Yang versioning design team has been doing for the last few months, and then I'm going to talk through the requirements draft. So I hopefully can have some helpful or interesting discussion on that and what we do next and how we go forward. So a very quick update on what the design team's been doing. It was formed after IETF 101. It took a little while to get going, but once it did get going, we had weekly meetings the last couple of months. The focus has been very specifically on the problem statement and the requirements themselves rather than any solutions or solution discussions. There has been some, but that's what the focus has been. We've produced a requirements draft, a 00 draft, and that's what I'll go over next. I'll go over the requirements in detail, and then there'll be some discussion on what the next steps could or should be, and I'll cover that at the end. There may be a slot to discuss the CLAR draft, which is one of the potential solutions here, if there's time. So we'll see how time goes. So the requirements draft is fairly basic. We have a short summary of the problem, and we've included the in the background information the examples that were from the CLAR draft. They've been refined somewhat, but they're fundamentally the sort of same sort of examples in there, extended a bit. So they sort of set a reasonable background in a fairly concrete way of what the issues are. We then got the requirements, problem statement text, and I'll go over that problem statement here, or summary of it, and then the requirements. And then afterwards, I'm going to be asking for, or we should discuss working group adoption, not necessarily as a way to take this all the way to RFC, but to show that the working group agrees broadly what the requirements are, and we're heading in the right direction. So the problem statement summary. So Yang versioning, in terms of what we want to do, Yang obviously has had quite a rigid way in terms of how you do upgrades in the past, that they have to always be fully backwards compatible. And effectively in the market, we found some issues with that, and that's what we're trying to address and change here. Rather than requiring that your Yang models are perfect or perfection on day one, we want to allow them to evolve over time to the right solution. The current mechanism is that once you've published your Yang model, you can make no backwards no non-backwards compatible changes to the module. So you are allowed to add new leaves, you're allowed to extend the value space, that's the thing, but you can't either reduce the value space or change the type or delete a data node and things. And I think that this has, this sort of inflexibility has made people try almost too hard to get Yang models to be perfect at the point they publish them. So it's taken a long time, I think, for IETF to publish Yang models because people think, well, once it's out there, it's hard for me to change. And the cost of doing that change is quite high. On to the second point, if you do have non-backwards compatible changes today, then you are forced into one of two routes. Either you have to introduce new data nodes to represent those non-backwards compatible changes, or you have to have a new module name. And both of those have a hugely high impact on implementations. So if you have to be forced to a new path, then every client that was using that existing path is now forced to use a new path, so an impact there. And if you change the module namespace, the impact is even worse. So everyone that's interacting, all the clients interacting with that module obviously now have to interact with the new module name, and all the imports that are importing this will also need to be updated to import that new module name. So if, for example, you wanted to make a non-backwards compatible change to IETF interfaces, perhaps one of the minor leaves, for example, if you're forced to change it to IETF interfaces 2, then effectively you're going to fragment the include or import statements from all those other modules. So, so that's not really necessarily a viable solution. There's some other related issues as well that aren't quite so so directly tied to backwards compatibility, but related to this whole thing about life cycle of models. And one of them is that today, the way that Yang defines status deprecated, it gives the server the choice as to whether or not it implements those nodes. And that means that a client that's interacting with one of those servers, if they see a node that's marked status deprecated, they do not know whether the server's going to implement that or not. The only way they can find out is by trying to write to it and see if it's there, or read from it and see if it's there. So I think that is too ambiguous in terms of that behavior, and we need to try and tidy that up in one way or another. Another related thing is that if you look at how deprecation is handled in programming languages, then on APIs there is often you'll have a statement saying what the alternative is. So if it says, you know, this API is going away, they'll say you could use this other API instead, or give an explanation as to why it's gone away. So currently Yang doesn't have that. The status statement just says, you know, what the current status is. And although you have the option maybe of updating the description statement associated with the data node, a better solution probably is to have a description statement or equivalent tied in with that status. So you can actually say it's been deprecated for this reason, and this is what the alternative is. This is the way forward. And that's all about almost, I guess, sort of forward guidance to people who are using models that are being in the process of being deprecated and they're being changed over time. And then the final point in terms of problem statement is that some systems where we are sort of generating Yang models, they simply can't follow the strict rules that we have. It's just not pragmatic. That with the models that are being developed in IETF, then you have this option, and almost IETF is heading for that, of creating a close to perfect model from day one. And that you'd be very strict in saying, okay, we won't allow any non-backwards compatible changes. The cost of that's too high. But when it comes to the vendors and things, and these Yang models are often being generated from other internal data models, and those internal data models may well be quite closely aligned to implementation or the hardware, that sort of thing, then you have issues that as things change and evolve over time, it's sometimes just not pragmatic to never make any non-backwards compatible changes. So the cost of maintaining that backwards compatibility is too high relative to the impact it will be on clients and things. So as it stands today, then it's certainly the case that quite a lot of vendors are making non-backwards compatible changes in their Yang models as they go forward. And so I think we should be trying to look for a solution that standardizes and explains, manages what people are actually doing, rather than pretending that nobody should do it. So any comments or questions on the problem statement before I move on to the requirements? So the requirements themselves, there's 5 slides for these, I think about 15 requirements in total. My intention here, I've grouped them by effectively the section that they come under. I'll read through each of the requirements to summarize it, and then if people have got any comments or questions on those, then please come up as I go through these. So the first requirement, a mechanism is required to update a module in a non-backwards compatible way without forcing all modules with import dependencies on the updated module from being updated at the same time. So effectively what you're saying is that when you want to update a module in a non-backwards compatible way, you need to have a mechanism that allows other people that are importing it not to have to change their import statements. It's too expensive to say, I've updated IETF interfaces and hence you will have to go and update every other model, I don't know, 50 plus of them that are importing IETF interfaces. There needs to be a way that by and large those import statements can stay the same unless they're affected. The second requirement is a mechanism is required to update a module in a non-backwards compatible way without forcing all clients and servers to access data nodes in the model on new paths or a new module namespace. Specifically, if a particular data node is updated in a non-backwards compatible way, then it may be desirable for it to be available on the same path and in the same module namespace. So, so this is the same, closely related to 1.1, but it's saying from a client perspective, if you are interacting with one of these modules, that if you make a non-backwards compatible change, it's not good enough to say, oh, well, the answer is to use a new module name or to use a new module namespace. Or to say you have to add a new data node to represent this and mark the previous one as deprecated, but that is too expensive. And the specific comment here is that if there was, say, a small subset of a module that maybe was under an if feature statement, it was something that was added in late on in the process and it didn't really get enough review or coverage and people weren't using it, and then at the point that they come to use it, they say, oh, actually, this is broken, I need to fix this. The only way to fix that is either by saying, well, I've got to rev the whole module. So all the bits of the module that are fine are being used, you'd force a namespace change, a module name on that. Or you'd force effectively to continue supporting this deprecated part and at the same time support a newer revision of it, a fix-up model. So we're suggesting that there needs to be a way to handle that. The third requirement that's related to this is that a refined form of Yang's import statements must be provided that is more restrictive than import any revision, i.e. just import, and less restrictive than import a specific revision, like import by revision. Once non-backward compatible changes to modules are allowed, the refined import statement is needed to express the correct dependency between modules. So, so what Yang has today is you can either import a module and not specify a revision, in which case it's ambiguous as to what revision you get. An implementation is only allowed to implement one revision, but it can import multiple ones. And so that allows the modules to float and be modified and updated, okay, but it doesn't give you any control over that if you do any Yang versioning. The other side, the other end of the spectrum, is that in Yang 1.1 they allowed import with a specific revision, but this has problems too. So you now constrain the problem space to say, I want to import just that one particular revision. But if somebody comes along and makes a minor change to that or a bug fix to that imported module, suddenly your import dependency is broken. So, and that broken import dependency would effectively propagate through all the other modules. So I think the import by revision doesn't really necessarily work that well. I think it's too limited. The cases where you can use it in a sensible way, I think is very small, maybe some types and things. So what's being proposed here in the requirements is saying there needs to be something that's between those two extremes, where you can say, I want to import a set of revisions with this major version number, or these sets of major version numbers, or any minor version number, this fixed major and any minor. So there needs to be enough flexibility that you can tailor what you can import and what you can't import. So does anyone have any questions or comments on these requirements before I move to the next slide? Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, Chris Hops of Deutsche Telekom. So I've been a proponent in the past of just using the namespace name change. So it looks like 2 of these requirements are specifically addressed to that. I'm curious, I mean, so these are the requirements. Obviously, there's some kind of justification for them, right? Like it's too hard, or because I'm thinking specifically about 1.1, right? I mean, why wouldn't you want to go back and at least look at your, I mean, if you're importing a model and you have now a backwards incompatible change, right? Why isn't not reasonable to say I need to go and change one line in my model to say I've looked at this and I know it's still compatible? That doesn't seem like too much work. It actually seems like a safety valve. Then number 1.2 though, isn't that what prefixes are for? I understand like you don't want to create a ton of work, right, where there doesn't need to be any, right? Like if I'm using a model and a client, I'm using a model and nothing changed that I care about, right? Then I don't really want to have to do much work. But in that case, you know, all my paths and stuff are using prefixes. Again, it should just be a one-line change. So, you know, now we're talking about changing one line is too much work.
I think it depends on, I think it depends on how well people have coded the clients and whether people are using fixed paths or whether they are putting a decent level of abstraction there from a client perspective.
Do you think anybody's actually putting namespace things in all their node specifications?
I don't know.
Well, okay, but that we shouldn't optimize for dumb design, right? I mean,
but even without that, even without including the client issue, you still have the import statement issue. As soon as you change the name of the module, you force all those imports to change.
Yeah, because you have to go back and make sure that they're actually compatible still, right? It's only one line. That's not too much to ask, I think, to say I've looked at this thing, it's still compatible, I change this line, I'm done.
But it's not that one module, it's all modules, and then that would potentially propagate through. So,
but you don't want any of those modules to automatically use the new model until you've actually looked at it, right? I mean, that's work you have to do when you make a backward incompatible change, if you want to use the new model, right? I mean, you don't have to use the new model, you could be using the old model still, and then everything keeps working. It's only when you want to update to the new model that the namespace changes, and then you have to go change your one line in your model, say I'm going to use the new one.
So it depends on the scope of what that non-backwards compatible change is. So if it was, if IETF interfaces, for example, you were completely restructuring it, then I think that sort of thing you would say, well, it's fair enough to define an IETF interfaces too. That's probably the right answer. But if you were changing something that is not going to break all those imports, if it's like a leaf in the model that you're changing in a non-backwards compatible way, then it seems quite a lot of work to then say, I'm to change this one leaf. I made a mistake here. I got a bug and I want to change it. I want to change its type. And then you're forced effectively, everyone has to update their imports to do that, to pick up that latest leaf, and they're not going to be impacted. So I think there's still meant to be some common sense in terms of what non-backwards compatible changes are meant to be. I don't think we're trying to say there should be free reign and anyone can do anything. I don't think that's the aim here. It's trying to be pragmatic.
Okay, I mean, I do see, I take your point that there might be small incompatible changes, but they also might not be that important, right? So I don't know. Okay, anyway, that was my.
So Tim Kirinoka, just to follow on, but isn't what you're saying in 1.2 just what you said you're trying to get away from? What you're saying is in 1.2, I have a leaf node, call it foo,
yeah,
right? That I change in a non-backward compatible way, and the client still will reference foo, right? Even though he doesn't know it's not backward compatible, or potentially.
So the proposal is effectively, if you use some sort of versioning, semantic versioning or equivalent scheme here, is that you would then have a change to the version associated with the file. So the old module still exists.
But that's the module level.
You're getting into a solution. I think if you another way to answer that same question is you have a requirement later to cover what he's talking about to ensure that you cover the backward compatibility.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
But I'm talking just about the requirement.
Right, there's more requirements.
I understand. I read them all.
Okay.
Okay. And so, and this is the one requirement that I had a concern about was because I looked at it from the standpoint of the client having something called foo, right? That was not backward compatible, that if I read this requirement that said, well, I'm required to not give you any indication that this is not backward, that this is, as a client, I don't know that this is not backward compatible. That data node, that leaf node, foo, that I'm using, right?
So that's not the intention here. I mean, it's not the intention to be saying, obviously, in terms of the requirements is, the expectation is the clients can find out that something's changing in a non-backwards compatible way.
I read requirement, the set of 3 to cover the exact concern you have.
Okay.
So whether,
So you got to put 3 of them together.
so if requirement 3 doesn't cover your case, we should fix the language on it.
1.3, you mean?
3, we haven't gotten to all the
Okay,
requirements.
all right. So I'll wait for 3 and I'll put it in that context.
Yeah.
Because this was the only requirement that I had the biggest concern with.
Yeah, Italo Guzzi from Huawei. I have the feeling that here you are considering the case where you upgrade the server to a new version which is not backward compatible. You want the client to run smoothly in backward compatible way. What happens the other way around? You upgrade a client using a YAM model which is not backward compatible and you don't upgrade the server. Are you considering this case? Consider, for example, the situation where you have a hierarchical controller which is controlling multiple domains, and you have a new features, and a subset of these domains suppose a new feature, and a subset of those domains do not and do not upgrade. Are you considering also this use case?
So I think the versioning is happening between a client-server interaction, and we're certainly considering the case that you want to do some sort of control and maybe version selection between those. So in the case of a controller where I'm talking to servers where some of them support some functionality and some don't, I would expect there to be some negotiation on each of those.
Oh, so you are expecting some version negotiation between the client and the server to figure it out how to talk to each other?
Well, version selection again is going to the solutions, but there is a requirement to support backwards compatibility, to support existing clients in a backwards compatible way.
Yeah, but what about existing servers? It's the case where you upgrade a client and you don't upgrade a server.
So if you had a client that's, you can't have a client that's talking a newer Yang model to a server that's talking an older one. I think that wouldn't work. I don't think we've got.
Wants to detect that case.
You can detect that case because you can know what versions that the server's using through Yang library.
Okay.
You could detect that today.
Okay. What about if you have a new YAM model, you don't use a new leaves because you know the server doesn't support the new leaves?
So you ultimately you can't write to a leaf that the server doesn't understand. You can never make.
No. Yes. True. But you can if the upgrade is you add a new nodes, a new leaf, and leaf is associated with, for example, with a feature. Then a YAM model, you can upgrade the server, the client, without upgrading the server, and the server will be. You don't have the feature, something like that.
Sorry, say that again.
You can, if you have the new features to your YAM model, which is associated with an optional feature, as soon as you talk with an old server that doesn't support the feature, you will never use that leaf. You use only the subset of the 2 YAM models, which is common. But now, because of the non-backward compatible changes, you don't have any longer the common subset.
I think you still end up, still think your mechanism to do the same thing. So in terms of the requirements, the requirement is it comes onto the later requirements, actually we're taking away obviously Yang's forward compatibility effect. You can always upgrade things. And as part of that, we've got requirements to say, what are we going to offer instead as a way to support existing clients? Yeah?
Igor Briskin, Huawei. I support the issue that Italo just raised. So if the client works, say, with 20 servers and works in the exact same way, so now if you have like a model which is not backward compatible, right? Some of them do things differently from others, and there's no common ground, okay, on which you can scale down and come up with a common solution, right? So it's a big issue.
So again, I think actually that question might be worth looking at the end of the requirements, because again, there is a requirement to address that concern.
Balázs and Ericsson. I think that's the case today as well, because you can just obsolete or deprecate something.
It's true.
It's gone. And then your client suddenly finds that, oh, I thought this was compatible, but it's not there anymore. Also, for the other way around, if you need a feature, you need to check the revision of the model on the Yang server. Maybe that I have an old module on the Yang server that doesn't have my feature yet because it's an old module. So I think anyway a client has to check the revision of all modules before really working. And that, at least for our systems, that's the case today. So that's not changed or updated by this recommendation.
Right, so I'm going to move on to the next set of requirements. So identifying...
Do you want to warn people that there's actually 5 sets?
There are 5 sets, that's true. Okay. This one's harder to read. So readers of modules and tools that use modules must be able to determine whether changes between 2 revisions of a module constitute a backwards compatible or non-backwards compatible version change. In addition, it may be helpful to identify whether those changes represent bug fixes, new features, or both. So it's saying that you have to have a way in this scheme of identifying that when a module's been updated, it's been updated in a non-backwards compatible way or a backwards compatible way, and maybe some indication as to what that scope of the change is. So is it a bug fix? Is it new functionality, or is it major new functionality? And then requirement 2.2, a mechanism should be defined to determine whether data nodes between 2 arbitrary Yang module revisions have 1 not changed, 2 changed in a backwards compatible way, and 3 changed in a non-backwards compatible way. So whereas requirement 2.1 is at a module level, it's saying whether or not that whole module has been changed in a backwards compatible or non-backwards compatible way. 2.2, which is a should rather than a must, is actually looking at tracking backwards compatibility on a per data node basis. And this may be particularly important where you have, where clients are using subsets of modules rather than the entire, all the leaves in a module, then they may be particularly interested whether the subset that they're using, they can move between an older revision and a new revision in a backwards compatible way, and hence be able to identify that on a per data node basis is potentially a better solution, possibly. Alex.
Alex M. Huawei. So why limit this to data nodes? Why not also other things, RPCs, certification, etc.? Does it apply there as well?
They should probably be included. Schema nodes. Well, you wanted the... I'm not sure schema nodes are the right answer as well. I think it might be data node. I can't remember what the definition is. But yes, those, but you're not trying to track the change of, say, a type statement itself. You want to type to the actual thing that's instantiated in the model, in the schema. Any other questions on these, or shall I move quickly on to try and get through all these requirements? We can come back. So, requirements 3, supporting existing clients. So this is all about, we've had some discussion about this in terms of how do you handle clients that are already talking to the server. And so the solution must provide a mechanism to allow servers to support existing clients in a backwards compatible way. So whatever solution to meet these requirements comes up with, it has to have a way that if you've got an older client talking to the server, that it can continue to talk to that server, or there needs to be a mechanism or a way of how to support that. And then related to that is 3.2, the solution must provide a mechanism to allow servers to simultaneously support clients using different revisions of modules. A client's choice of particular revision of one or more modules may restrict the particular revision of other modules that may be used in the same request or session. So this requirement is saying that the any solution space needs to have a way that clients can choose which module revisions or versions they're talking to. And that doesn't, but they don't have free reign. They can't say, I want to have maybe one version of the BGP module and a completely different version of IETF interfaces module where there's dependencies between them. This probably means that actually when you select one version of a module or a set of modules, that you're selecting between a set of them, and that effectively constrains the space you act in. Example of this, concrete example might be that if you have a vendor that's producing particular software releases, maybe they say, well, we support an older revision of our software and the later one or something similar, something like that. So that one's what that's suggesting. Any comments on these ones?
Rob, Kent as a contributor.
Yeah.
So when you say existing clients here, do you mean clients that are today? Clients using existing Yang date stamp sort of version, or do you mean like more forward thinking that after Semver or whatever the solution is existing clients at that time and then you are moving to the next version?
So I think existing clients today have to be able to talk to these servers. You can't just cut them off.
So this kind of moves into what is the migration or transition strategy? Okay.
Chris Hops, Deutsche Telekom. So I think this is a requirement that actually pops out because of you saying you need to be able to have multiple modules without different namespace names.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Just want to point that out. You don't have this problem if you don't have that.
Chris, what you're saying is a solution to this requirement. That's
Well, I'm saying if you get rid of requirement one and you just keep the things the way they are, I mean, we're creating problems, right, that didn't exist before. You can have multiple modules if they have different namespaces.
So one solution to this whole problem is to do nothing and say that what Yang does today is fine.
I don't think that's not actually what I'm advocating for, but anyway, I'll keep going. I just wanted to point out that.
But Chris, if you have like a solution in mind that satisfies all the requirements, except for like you change names and there's some interesting way to do it, well, that's worth talking about.
Oh, I'm making comments. Let's get to a good solution.
So the fourth set of requirements is documenting data node lifecycle. So 4.1, I might have lost the text at the bottom here. 4.1, a mechanism is required to allow a client to determine whether deprecated nodes are implemented by the server. So this goes back to today that the deprecated statement doesn't mean that the device is necessarily implementing it. It leaves it ambiguous. So there needs to be some way that a client can at least find out whether or not those deprecated nodes will be implemented. 4.2, if a data node is deprecated or obsolete, then it must be possible to document in the Yang model what alternatives exist, the reason for the status change or any other status related information. So that goes back to the same comment that I had earlier in the problem statement, that when you do deprecate something or you're about to, then having additional information or having a mechanism to provide information to readers and users of the module as to why it's gone away and what the alternatives are is required. 4.3, I have to scroll this text. A mechanism is required to indicate that certain definitions in a Yang module will become status obsolete in future revisions, but definitions marked as such may still be something implemented by.
You don't mind small text.
Where are we at? So we're on to 4.3, yeah. A mechanism is required to indicate that certain definitions in a Yang module will become status obsolete in future revisions, but definitions marked as such may still be implemented by a compliant service. This sounds like a strange one, but effectively it means that if we don't change the definition of Yang's deprecated statement to mean it's still supported, but it will go away in the future. If we don't do that, then instead we need to introduce some alternative mechanism to do the equivalent of a deprecated that means it's supported today, but it's going to go away in future, i.e. the standard definition of deprecated you'd see in like a programming language API. And then 4.4, which is not even on the slide because it's wrapped, is if multiple revisions of a Yang module are published, then the solution should allow for bug fixes to be made to an older revision of the module. So the idea here is that if you have multiple release trains and you are updating modules on different release trains, like vendor modules, there needs to be a way of putting bug fixes and changes to those older release modules. It's not sufficient just to say every change or bug fix has to go in to the latest revision. That's not pragmatic. Oh, I've lost my slides. Right, then I'll move on to the requirements number 5. And these requirements are related to documentation and education. So 5.1 says the solution must provide guidance to model authors and clients on how to use the Yang versioning scheme. So we obviously have to tell people how to use it, what's the right mechanism. 5.2 is the solution is required to describe how to transition from the existing Yang 1.0, 1.1 versioning scheme to the new scheme. So obviously you've got to describe how we migrate from where we are today. And then 5.3 is the solution must describe how the versioning scheme affects the interpretation of instance data and references to instance data, for which the scheme definition has to be updated in a non-backwards compatible way. So this one is quite interesting, and it says, if, for example, you have some configuration on a device, which you can regard as instance data, and you then update that device in a non-backwards compatible way, what happens to that data? What happens to the bits that are non-backwards compatible? Or another case would be is Balaz's instance data document, where that is defining some instance data. What happens if the modules that are being used to represent that data have changed in a non-backwards compatible way? So the solution needs to consider this and describe how is that supported. And that finishes my requirements thing. So the question is, are there any questions on the requirements? Are there any questions that going back to those points that happened earlier?
So I don't know if I zoned out at the very beginning of when you started. Did we actually talk about what problem we're trying to solve?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, that's what these are speaking to, but so, I mean, I've got a pretty good idea that I don't want to talk to solutions too early, right? But, you know, I think the thing we're really trying to do is allow for, I mean, I remember you saying allow for changes more quickly, but I think a lot of what is going on here is to make it less painful for clients, right? So you want, like, if I can make this incompatible change, but everybody's going to keep running anyway because they don't hardly use that little thing over there, right? You know, and there's obvious, like, semantic versioning is a fit for all the requirements you've put up there. But really I think the important thing is describing the things that changed, having maybe an automatic way to do that, right? And linking, right? And the major version number of the semantic is really just the linking, right? So I guess what I'm saying is I've never liked the major version of the semantic. I don't think we need it. But we might need a way to say this namespace, the new version, you know, a pointer to it, right? And maybe as part of that metadata, you include the changes, right? Anyway, I don't want to jump too far into solutions, but because I like the way that it's backward compatible with things that don't, you know, it's like nothing has to change for this to keep working, right? And then things that do change can use the new stuff you're coming up with here.
Yeah.
Whereas, and if you require like a semantic version, you know, it's not as backward compatible. But that's my main objection to that sort of solution.
Okay, so I think, and after this one, I'll discuss solutions. We will invite people to, if you've got alternative solutions, then it's definitely worth putting that forward.
Get Netmod, Juniper Networks. So what makes me a little bit nervous when looking at this is what exactly does backward compatible mean and how do we define it? Because obviously if something crashes, you know it wasn't backwards compatible, but if you really want to write something saying, okay, I need to decide, is it not backwards compatible, yes or no?
Okay.
And we had discussions before about which statement was legal and whether we'd accept it or not. So how would you kind of grasp this in the requirements? So, or in other words, as a requirement, I would like to add here something to define what we consider to be backwards compatible that can be checked. That, you know, that helps me as a coder say,
Yes, I think that's fine. That's worth adding. So the definition we're taking is the one that's in RFC 7950. So they've got a description of updating a module, and the rules as to how you update a module are, these are the rules on what you're allowed to do in a backwards compatible way. So any changes you make to a module outside what's allowed in RFC 7950 is by definition a non-backwards compatible change. So, but I think we can add a statement to the draft to clarify that.
Yeah, thank you.
Got a question? Yeah.
Vladimir. I have the sense that making this for the node level, for me it feels like it's over-engineering it. And I can put it in the same category as introducing submodules. Like when you introduce submodules and people start using huge modules of multiple submodules, suddenly you have that problem that you need to introduce a solution for node level compatibility. So if we stay aware of that, I would be very happy.
Okay, so the justification for node level is not necessarily a version statement at the node level, but because one of the ideal solutions here is to be able to do this in an automated way, to have tooling to be able to detect whether going from any given revision of module to any other revision is backwards compatible or not, and where it is backwards compatible and where it's not. And you can do 95% of that today. So the rules are quite clear and you can pick up what's changed. But what you can't detect automatically is if you change the semantics of a node in a description statement. There's just no way that tooling can understand and read English or where it's written in. And so the idea there is having some way of marking those changes to then allow this tooling to work and to actually then say, okay, this part of the module is entirely backwards compatible and these changes are not. And you, as a user of that module, if you can refine and say, I'm only using this subset, you can say, well, although the module might be a non-backwards compatible change, I'm not using it, so I don't care.
Can we get your name one more time for the minutes, please?
Vladimir Vasilev.
Thank you.
So requirements draft next steps. So I think the question here really is does the working group agree with these requirements? Certainly we've had some feedback on some of them. There's not been major objection. So what the design team would like is we'd like for the requirements draft to be adopted by the working group. And the aim here is not to say that we will necessarily take this all the way to RFC status, but it's to try and get it as a working group document that people can then comment on, to broadly say that yes, they think that these requirements are roughly the right scope and we're going in the right direction in terms of the problem statements. And then over time, depending on what the solution looks like, either these requirements might get folded into that, or maybe if there's multiple solution drafts that are working together, maybe there'd be a separate, the requirements that would be taken to RFC.
I have to say I have a strong objection. I mean, I might be the only one, but I have a strong objection to the requirement in one, right? Because you're forcing a solution. You're saying a requirement of this is that you have to be able to do this without changing the namespace. And I'm saying changing the namespace is one of the solutions, that you can do everything else you want to do through a different mechanism, but leave the change in the namespace. So having that as a requirement is removing all those solutions.
Okay.
Balázs Lengyel Eriksson, I actually don't really agree with you, because the reason we want to keep the namespace and the name module name in this next requirement is that it is sometimes much more expensive to change the name and namespace to reflect compatibility than to deal with any problems that might be raised by the incompatible but changed, incompatible but still kept namespace. You have to track down all the potential clients, scripts, whatever, who have written. It's impossible really to track them down. So yeah, sometimes it's and it's a rare in the rare case where you say that yes, a backwards incompatible change is validated, is reasonable, and it should be a rare case. it is much cheaper to keep this, because once you start changing the namespace or the module name, then that means that all your importers, all your clients, be that just maybe a little script that some operator, must be updated. So that one line you mentioned, one line update multiplied by, I don't know how many, and tracking down all those one lines. That, of course, gets very, very expensive, even more expensive than sometimes taking the hit of a backward incompatible change.
Right. So what I mentioned this at the very end. I wanted to give a solution, right? That this is what you could do with linking, right? You can have a link between the two different namespaces, and you could have the clients automatically, you can still have an automatic upgrade mechanism, right? Where they run with the new module because they know they're compatible, because they looked at the list of things that would make them incompatible, right? I mean, it's literally just a way to leave backward compatibility, right? Because we're talking about moving forward, things would be designed with the solution. But when you keep the namespace the same, now you don't have the backward incompatible way to blow them away.
But then, but that isn't that the same?
And I'm not saying that. By the way, I'm not saying that. Maybe I'm wrong, right? I'm just objecting to a requirement that removes a set of solutions.
Which I think then we can look at refining that text.
What specific language do you see here that removes the solution you're envisioning?
Requirement 1.1 and 1.2, it says this must be doable without changing the namespace name.
Where do you see that?
Well, 1.1 doesn't say that.
Yeah.
Am I missing it? Does it say namespace in either of these? All right, thank you.
So that's it. I'm in the end, maybe I'll think, oh, this is you guys were all right. Right. I'm just objecting that it's limiting the solution space at the get-go.
So perhaps we should revisit the phrasing of 1.2 to make it so it's more open to different solutions.
Yeah, maybe like what you're really intending there, right?
Yeah.
It's not you're sort of describing what you're intending through a solution.
Yeah, that wasn't the intention, but yes, we can see refinements.
If I understand it correctly, this option of changing the name of a module is already here, but probably because quite a few people, including myself, thought this is not
viable.
Not a good way to do this. That's so. In a way, if we want to change module names, that we can, and if we agree that it is sufficient, we can just stop this work and.
Well, I think Chris's comment is slightly different. He's saying that maybe there's a problem to be solved here, but it might not be that this is the problem. But the problem is that you can't handle changing the names of modules in an easier way. And potentially a different solution would be to find a better way that could be managed. Is that fair? So I don't think we're trying to preclude solutions here. So I think I'm happy that we can try and refine this refinement text that potentially allows that. So what do we do here in terms of, we need to look at refining this requirements text for 1.2, but in terms of, do we do that on the EDIS and then ask for work group adoption after that? How does that work?
I think it would be worthwhile to see, just sort of get the feel for the room of how many people are feeling comfortable with the requirements presented, with an understanding that we need to fix 1.2 at least, and just sort of get the feel of the room. So I'll ask a couple of questions, comfortable, not comfortable, and maybe disinterested. So how many feel comfortable with the requirements as they've been presented for the problem that the design team is trying to solve? I'd call that a pretty reasonable number. Yeah, subject to the modifications that have been discussed. So that's a pretty reasonable number. How many are uncomfortable with the requirements as they've been discussed? I see no one. Oh, I see. Please. So I think we saw one person raise their hand who I think they've already been to the mic and expressed what their discomfort was, and they're nodding their head yes. And how many are think this is not a problem that we should even be talking about? And no one, and I'll note Lada is still in the room. All right. Okay, well, I think that's a pretty good direction. It sounds like do you want to try to address the issues first before we do an adoption call, or do an adoption call on this version, and with the understanding that we're going to try to address really the 2 points that were raised here. The one, I took away the one as the 1.2, as in don't be prescriptive or don't constrain the solution. And then the other one was, if I understood it correctly, was about complexity.
So
we have some folks lining up.
Benoit Claes. So actually, maybe you could postpone this question for Friday, because you've got the design team meeting on Thursday. So maybe you could try to directly address this and ask again at that time.
Sure. Maybe.
I don't know.
Maybe the design team can meet and have a new version by Friday.
I mean, this is what I'm trying to propose.
Yeah, I mean, submissions are unlocked now, so if it sounds like you guys are comfortable either way. So yes, if you have a new draft, then that's certainly something we can ask about.
Jason Stern, I think at the last working group and still now, it seems like there's a lot of interest in progressing on this topic. So I'm not sure if there's a lot of point in not adopting it. The working groups thinking about it and working on it. We're going to refine it. There's people with different viewpoints, but
yeah, the question is really just do you want to resolve the issue, the open issue that was raised here. So why don't we plan to poll this in short order after the meeting, and if you've published a new version, then that's what we'll poll, and if you haven't, we'll poll there. And for those who have comments, please feel free to reiterate them on email if they haven't been addressed. I'm not sure we fully captured that other comment, so it would be really good to get that on the list. So thank you. All right.
And if I could just, Kent as a contributor, with regard to the Yang data discussion, Yang data, I mean, there's a namespace, but there's no other instance data or anything to identify what version of the module was used to encode that Yang data. So I'm not sure if this is an issue, requirements would need to address it, or maybe it's a problem the Yang data authors need to resolve. Thoughts on that?
I don't understand your question at all.
Yeah, I don't either. You have, if you use Yang data, you do an import to use it, right? You end up having to import the module that defines the Yang data in order to use it. So if you're,
I'm saying, no, if you have an instance document that's using Yang data, inside the instance document, there may be like the name of the JSON namespace or the XML namespace, but there's no other versioning.
Correct.
There's no relation to what version of the module.
Yeah. Oh, yes. So that may potentially, you may need to update the instance data document to actually say at the top of that, what are the revisions of the module that it's using, maybe. But that's.
I guess my question is there a requirement that you think the design team might need to take, or is it really on the Yang data authors to worry about that
sounds
problem?
like a Yang data. Sounds like a Yang data
okay.
thing to me.
Yeah.
I thought Balazs was going to bring up his draft that he's presenting Friday. Say that's the way to solve it.
So the next step. So on the assumption that we'll adopt this document fairly soon, we'll continue to refine the requirements as people have comments on things. They'll stay open as a document. But the next step for us is to actually consider the possible solutions. So I want to make quite clear that solution proposals and ideas are welcome. Chris, in particular, if you've got an alternative solution, please sketch it out to us. Maybe if you're free on Thursday, come along. There'll be a point that we hopefully could discuss it as well. At the moment, we're only really aware of the one that you got potentially and one other solution draft that's out there. So at the moment, there's certain aspects of that solution that we are considering and what the impacts of that would be. So we're hoping to give an update on the Clark draft, but I think we'll do that afterwards if there's time. And then, so once we consider the possible solutions, the idea of the design team is to progress a particular solution to a working group adopted solution draft. And then after that, At the moment, the remit is for that to close the design team and the authors of that solution draft to take it forward. So in terms of
Can I ask a question on the prior slide?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, great, thanks. So in considering possible solutions, obviously the members of the design team have a set of solutions that they're familiar with. If we have other people who want to bring solutions such as Chris or someone else who's out there, what's the best way to sync with the design team? Do you want a full draft? Can people drop you email? Do you want it on the list? What do you think would be a good way to sort of socialize ideas with the design team? So
certainly I don't think we need a full draft. I'm happy for it to be an email. I think that a low barrier to entry is good as well. It's thought out. I would suggest sending that to the design team. Copying the Netmod alias is fine as well. There's no issues there. In terms of, and again, if you've got solutions for just some of the requirements, you say, well, I've got a good idea of how we can solve these problems, then that's fine, that's great. I think some of these requirements are sort of some fairly obvious solutions, like the deprecated potentially, and adding a description statement to status seems like a no-brainer almost. So some of those I think are fairly easy. Other ones I think is more pragmatic. So whatever's the easy way to do it is my suggestion. And I think we should also send an email out to the Netmod alias to highlight this to everyone who's reading to say, look, there's this opportunity. Okay. And I would suggest maybe trying to get something in before the end of August, because I think it'll go quiet over the summer, so that gives people some time, and then we'll pick up more steam after that, I suspect.
Okay, great. And just to be clear, from a working group process standpoint, the design team isn't the working group. So if you have a proposal and you talk to the design team and they're not keen on it, but you are, there's nothing that prevents you from bringing it to the working group and socializing it, and maybe the working group will even accept your proposal over the design team. And that's not hypothetical. That's actually happened to me before, where I disagreed with the design team and ultimately the working group accepted the solution I had proposed.
Okay. So this is sort of a hypothetical slide in terms of if we were to go forward with the semantic versioning solution, then there's various aspects. We already know what that would look like. So it would look like that we're going to add a semantic version number to Yang modules. We're going to potentially add an import by version number or a range of version numbers, or a major version number star, but effectively we would be modifying or extending the import behavior today, potentially through an extension statement. We would potentially consider changing the meaning of status deprecated, so change what that's defined as from what it is today to meaning this different definition. We would be changing the Yang module update rules that are in 7.950. They're quite strict as to what you're allowed to do, and obviously this work would be allowing those rules to be broken. And then perhaps again, we'd be requiring version selection, which would be changes to the protocols or extensions to the protocols to be able to select in some way what version of software a particular client is interacting with. And that may also require changes to Yang library effectively to represent that. So it's fairly clear that this would work as it looks at the moment. If this solution goes forward, the CLAR solution, then it would need to update 7.950. And so there is a question as to what the best way of doing that is. How do we do this work? So does this mean that we can do an extension statement or use extension statements to modify Yang in this way? Can we do an RFC that only defines Yang versioning and doesn't touch the existing drafts? Or does this require a Yang 1.2 or Yang 2.0, a Yang BIS document? And if we do that, is that going to then delay this work by a long time? How do we do this work in an efficient way to get to a good point without it taking a long period of time? And then related to that, some of the discussion that design teams had related to sort of Yang next is that there's a load of other stuff in Yang, in the Yang drafts that could be cleaned up. You could take the XML encoding out of Yang and put it into a separate RFC like the JSON one is. It'd be good to take the Netmod, the netconf related text out of 7.950 and put that into a netconf protocol draft. So there's a reasonable amount of cleanup work that could be done to the Yang draft. Could that work be done in parallel to this? Does that make sense? You know, what's the best way of going forward if we end up doing a Clark-like solution?
Kent as a contributor. So, I mean, so I think there's two approaches. One could, there's a Yang version that we have today that's in every Yang module. But if we were to change that, then that would necessitate a change in Yang. We need a new version of Yang. Another idea is to define an extension statement called, you know, whatever, semantic version Yang, whatever. But the problem with that is that extension statements are optional to implement. Yes. I'm sure the design team is sort of, that's exactly what you've been talking about, right?
Yeah, and it might be that you can, actually one option is you can do some of this work now, and you do an RFC that covers some of this, and you delay some of it. Maybe you delay the import by version to yang.next or something. I mean, it doesn't have to be that we cover everything in one go. Chris.
Yeah, Chris Hobbs. So this is the pain that we're feeling at DT right now is sort of it's like we get 1,000 models, right? Because the vendors update their models on every compile, right? Like, or whatever. And so I mean, we really do want some way to be able to easily say, okay, the model didn't actually change, right? I don't want to have to do any work. So I'm not actually fighting against that. I want that. This is what actually worries me, right? The reason that I'm so resistant against the namespace change is because you can maybe do all of this work without requiring, you know, we can get all the benefits if we approach this differently, right? You know, if you have a sort of sideband solution, right, where you have an extension or whatever that says, I'm going to describe how these two models are actually the same. Here are the changes. Now I can write my client software and it can automatically just work with the new version, and I don't have to wait for Yang 1.2, right, which is deadly long.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, that's the problem with that solution. Anything that requires waiting for another revision of Yang, I don't know. We have a problem now, right? We need solved. And like you said, I mean, it's affecting how we design modules. It's, you know, it's affecting everything. So.
Yep.
So there's definitely going to be different options out there. And this is the type of question that I think is really helpful to evaluate in the context of a specific solution. And as is always good engineering principle, if you can solve something in a less disruptive or simpler fashion, you know, there's going to be a bias towards that. Of course, if the simple solution is wrong, you know, it's wrong. It doesn't help you. So I think we should look at this while we're looking and evaluating different potential solutions, and certainly go to the simplest answer that solves the problem.
I'm not sure if it was mentioned in the requirements, but what happens if a module specifies a normal import by revision with an exact revision? So does it mean that the new solution can just get rid of this, so this is not taken into account? Or because if so, then I would advocate the option of going to a new Yang version, because then it's again.
What, to remove the existing import by revision?
Yes, so if it's import by revision, then it can be just ignored.
Okay.
If you have this new solution. So that would mean, again, some incompatible changes to Yang semantics.
So I think that would be, if we were doing Yang 1.2, you would potentially do that. But if you weren't, you wouldn't do Yang 1.2 for that reason, is my guess.
Yeah, we're getting one more comment. I would agree that I would suggest that Chris outline some solution that, and if the solution doesn't need any changes, that might be the best way to go.
So Chris, if you have time this week to sync up, that would be good. We're all here, so.
Yep, and we have another meeting on Friday. So we're going to wrap. I think Kent has some
Just
closing.
very quickly, Kent is a contributor on the very last question. There's been a lot of discussion about maybe thinking about how to modify 7950. It seems the first effort to that might be to iterate over the issues in GitHub Tracker and evaluate them on a few different dimensions, such as easy, hard, backwards compatible, not backwards compatible, important, not important, right? Like that. And so I think I'm, as a contributor, might do this. If others would like to work with me on that, perhaps we could have even an interim. I don't know if we want to actually call it an interim, but we could do something like this to try to get some more understanding about what that might be. We just don't know at the moment.
Yeah, and maybe it's worth trying to see if we can get some people this week to do a first pass through it together, just in a pub or something.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. We're at time. We'll be back here again on Friday at looks like 9:30. So see you then. Blue sheets up front, please.
Somebody put that on the remember you're on the mic. I know that there's this crazy speed. That's my desire. You want to start a new war? It's like a new war. There's no management control. Well, it doesn't matter. Okay.
It actually probably is probably more likely to keep people from forgetting things than the previous scheme, where I would just try and sneak them in.